An enormous draconian penalty or a light punishment that doesn't fit the crime. Over the Mexican Grand Prix weekend, Formula 1 finally got confirmation of Red Bull's penalty for breaking the budget cap in 2021, a $7 million fine and 10% reduction of its aerodynamic testing allowance for the next 12 months. Confirmation of Red Bull's £1.8 million overspend, reduced to just over £400,000 if a tax credit had been correctly applied, was quickly overtaken as a talking point by a debate over if Red Bull had got away lightly. The integrity of F1's budget cap has been at stake throughout this process, and it's not surprising to have heard completely different reactions to the punishment from Red Bull and its rivals. So what's Red Bull really lost, and what impact will that have? The fine is pretty irrelevant for a company of Red Bull's size, especially as it does not come out of its present or future cost cap. Reducing Red Bull's budget cap in the future wasn't an option for the FIA under the terms of an accepted breach agreement, which we'll explain a little later in the video. What matters most is the aerodynamic testing penalty, which has reduced Red Bull's wind tunnel and CFD limit by basically the equivalent of 1.5 finishing positions in the Constructors' Championship. Why have we mapped it out in those seemingly confusing terms? Well, last year F1 introduced a handicap system that means successful teams have less aero testing than those that finish lower down. From this season onwards, the team finishing last gets 115% of a baseline allowance, dropping by 5% for each position to only 70% for the winning constructor. The numbers are based on a limit for wind tunnel and CFD work for what is called an aerodynamic testing period, and there are 6 of these in the year, mostly lasting 8 weeks. Based on the normal allowances, as Constructors' Champion, Red Bull would be entitled to 70% of the baseline limit for 2023. This would equate to 224 wind tunnel runs and 1,400 CFD items per period, which is 16 wind tunnel runs fewer than nearest rival Ferrari and 32 fewer than Mercedes. In CFD terms, it would mean 100 items fewer versus Ferrari and 200 compared to Mercedes. But Red Bull's penalty for breaking the budget cap means a 10% reduction against what it was entitled to. So instead of 70% of the limit, Red Bull will have 63%. Red Bull calls this a draconian penalty and claims it could be worth anywhere between a quarter and a half a second of lap time. But what does it mean in reality? The penalty works out as a reduction of 22 wind tunnel runs and 140 CFD items per period. So for the next year from now, the second place team will have 38 more wind tunnel runs and 240 more CFD items during each period compared to Red Bull. That's not a game-changing amount, but in conjunction with the existing sliding scale, it's pretty significant. In real terms, Ferrari is set to have around 15% more development time than Red Bull, while Mercedes will have just over 20% more. Of note is the fact that Red Bull's limitation is valid for a period of 12 months from the date of the execution of the accepted breach agreement. That was entered into on Wednesday, October 26. That means that Red Bull's new limit kicks in immediately and will be valid for whatever development work it completes in the final part of 2022. That means the final stages of Red Bull's 2023 car development will be impacted. And as this will carry through to the end of October next year, Red Bull will also be limited in balancing its wind tunnel and CFD allowance across the in-season development of next year's car and any early work on the 2024 design. While it would be difficult to see the impact of this penalty, there will be one. Unsurprisingly though, Red Bull's rivals don't think it's enough. We can only imagine the smiles and eye-rolling in the Mercedes and Ferrari offices when Horner claimed the penalty would be even harder on Red Bull because its wind tunnel is a relic of the Cold War and has inefficiencies. Horner believes this type of punishment gives an advantage to our competitors, which is why they were pushing so hard for a draconian penalty. But rivals are unlikely to have any sympathy for Red Bull because ultimately the quality of a team's equipment has no bearing on what any sporting penalty should be. And more importantly, they think Red Bull has got away lightly. Ferrari believes the overspend equates to a performance gain of 0.2 seconds per lap, and the team is unhappy at what it perceives to be a very limited penalty. Ferrari argues that a 10% reduction in wind tunnel and CFD time does not correspond to the same amount of lap time, despite what Horner says. At Mercedes, trackside engineering director Andrew Shovlin has called Horner's claims of what the lap time impact will be for Red Bull an exaggeration. He also indirectly dismissed the claim Horner made that the new 2022 technical regulations are still immature and offering a steep development path. Chauvelin said that reducing the number of wind tunnel runs and CFD hurts most when developing a concept, but the prescriptive nature of the new rules means they have already been reasonably well explored. He thinks the penalty would only really hurt Red Bull if it has chosen an incorrect concept and needed to backtrack, perhaps a scenario Mercedes is all too aware of this year. Given Red Bull has already developed a very effective and efficient concept under F1's new rules, there is less likelihood it will suddenly start developing in the wrong direction in the season to come. Chauvelin amusingly pointed out that if this much aerodynamic testing time equated to the sort of lap time Horner has talked about, then back-of-the-grid teams from previous years would have produced cars 3 seconds faster than those at the front, given the extra aero development work they are now allowed to carry out. Instead, Mercedes reckons the Red Bull penalty will equate to a tenth or two. This assessment is consistent with one that Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto made ahead of the season when he said 10% more development time was worth maybe a tenth per lap if you are very good with using the extra time. Speaking of Ferrari, sporting director Laurent Mekies has pointed out a knock-on impact of the Red Bull penalty that his team is very unhappy with. Mekies reckons the basic effect of the penalty is that it will encourage Red Bull to spend their money elsewhere now it won't be going on as much wind tunnel and CFD work. So effectively, Red Bull has been given some freedom to pursue alternative development options like reducing weight of the car, which can yield huge performance gains. Red Bull has previously been adamant its submission was accurate, and it's still in a feisty mood on this matter. Despite rivals referring to the headline figure of £1.8 million, Red Bull maintains the real offence is just the 0.37% breach of £432,652 referenced by the FIA because the tax credit should be taken into account. And even that smaller breach has been disputed by Red Bull as its interpretation of the rules resulted in an initial submission that was several million below the cap. There are various key points that Red Bull and the FIA disagreed on: how the team's parts inventory could be accounted for under the cap, catering costs, sick pay, and the salary of Dan Fallows despite him being placed on gardening leave before what Horner called a Hollywood move to Aston Martin as technical director. Horner reckoned this equated to over £3 million and talked about all these topics at length, while the FIA's public summary of the ABA listed a total of 13 areas where Red Bull's cost cap accounting was incorrect in terms of its exclusions and adjustments. These included things that Horner did not talk about, for example gains on the disposal of fixed assets, power unit costs and travel costs. It illustrates how complex the process is, and Red Bull feels it got a raw deal with some of the FIA's interpretations of the rules. It still does not believe it did anything wrong in how it handled its submission and has refused to apologise for being the only team to break the budget cap. So with all that considered, why opt to accept the FIA's proposal for an accepted breach agreement rather than fight its corner and have the matter judged by an independent panel? We understand that a key part is that accepting the ABA protected Red Bull from a harsher penalty. In fact, if Max Verstappen hadn't won the 2021 title, Red Bull probably would have pursued its case further, which suggests there was at least an implicit threat of losing last year's championship. Red Bull safeguarded itself from that by entering into an ABA, as it does not allow for a points deduction or a future cost cap reduction. If a case went to the cost cap adjudication panel, these punishments would be on the table. So this is the F1 cost cap equivalent of a plea bargain. The FIA can trade off a slightly more lenient punishment against a rapid conclusion that Red Bull must accept and cannot challenge. In that sense, it was no surprise to hear Horner's admission that the prospect of a harsher penalty influenced the decision to begrudgingly accept the FIA's terms. Plus, the focus on Red Bull in recent weeks around its rules breach did the team a lot of reputational damage. Various senior figures in F1 have warned not to underestimate the significance of this, so drawing a line under the matter was definitely a priority for Red Bull. It was inevitable that this would end with Red Bull feeling harshly treated, while the same outcome was considered a light touch by its critics and rivals. But an outcome that nobody is satisfied with is probably a sign of a decent compromise. And there's one final important point to make. Now there have been so many clarifications in the first year of the rules, as we often see with technical regulations, there are no excuses for future breaches along these lines.